Not just walked, glided. Like the courtroom was a runway and she owned every square inch of it. A pale designer suit in immaculate ivory. Oversized sunglasses that did nothing to hide her disdain. Perfectly styled hair that looked like it had never met a bad day in sewer life. And on her wrist, a watch worth more than most of the spectators' cars. She didn't look left, she didn't look right, she only looked forward. As if this wasn't a court of law, but an inconvenience. A mistake in her schedule. Something beneath her. Her name was Victoria Langford. The headlines loved her family. Old money, real estate, oil, and political influence. Their name opened doors, closed investigations, and silenced problems before they could reach the front page. Except today. Today, the problem had reached Judge Joseph Wapner, and for the first time in a long time, the Langford name would not be enough. Victoria dropped into the defendant's chair like it was a lounge seat at a private club. She crossed her legs slowly, deliberately, making sure the room saw the red soles of her designer heels. The move wasn't an accident. It was a message. She didn't belong here. Not with fluorescent lights, cheap wooden benches, and people who couldn't pronounce the names on her necklace. She let out a small sigh, like the air itself offended her. Across the aisle, an older woman clutched a worn-out purse to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly. Her clothes were simple, colors faded from too many washes. Her name was Margaret Torres. She didn't belong here either, at least not for choice. She was the type of person who tried not to cause trouble, who avoided confrontation, who believed that the system was something distant, something for other people, until her life had collided with the Langford Empire. Judge Joseph Wapner entered the courtroom with quiet authority. He didn't rush, he didn't posture. He simply moved to the bench with the calm, measured steps of a man who had seen hundreds of cases, thousands of excuses, and every shade of arrogance. The room rose automatically. Everyone stood. Everyone except Victoria. She stayed seated, only glancing up with the mild curiosity one might show a waiter bringing the wrong drink. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she lazily uncrossed her legs, shifted, and pushed herself up like someone forced out of a comfortable chair. She smirked. Judge Wapner noticed. He always noticed. From the first seconds, the energy in the room was wrong. There was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the weight of entitlement pressing against an immovable object. Wapner adjusted his glasses. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room, reading everything. The stiff shoulders, the folded arms, the nervous glances from the audience. And then they landed on Victoria. She stared back, chin slightly raised, eyebrows drawn in the subtle, permanent question of the privileged. "Do you know who I am?" He had seen that look many times, from men with private jets, from women with PR teams and security details, from people who thought justice was something that could be negotiated or ignored. He knew exactly who she was, not by her name, but by her attitude. He also knew something else. That attitude never lasted long in his courtroom. He leaned toward the microphone, voice calm, composed, and steady. "This is the matter of Torres versus Langford." The words fell heavy in the space. On one side, a last name that meant power. On the other, a last name that meant nothing to the world outside this room. Inside this courtroom, they were equal. Victoria didn't believe that. Not yet. She shifted her weight, rolling her eyes almost imperceptibly as the case was summarized. Property damage, eviction, harassment. To her, it wasn't injustice. It was paperwork. The story, when laid out in cold, simple terms, was straightforward. Margaret Torres had lived in a small apartment building for 18 years.
It was old, creaking, and far from perfect, but it was home. Her children had taken their first steps in that cramped living room. She had worked double shifts, cleaned offices at night, saved every spare dollar to keep up with rent. Then the building was sold. The new owner? A shell company, traced back layer by layer, paper by paper, to the Langford family. Renovations were announced, rents were raised, tenants complained. The complaints went nowhere. Leaks weren't fixed, heating failed in winter, mold darkened the corners of the ceilings. When tenants insisted something had to be done, letters arrived instead, cold, formal, threatening. Pay more, move out, or be removed. Margaret didn't move out. What she didn't know was that her refusal had drawn the attention of someone who never liked being told no, Victoria. The building was a line item in her portfolio, a number in a spreadsheet, a project that needed clearing. And Margaret had become an obstacle, the kind of obstacle that usually disappeared when confronted with a letter from a very expensive lawyer. Margaret hadn't disappeared, so other tactics began. Noise at all hours, sudden inspections, contractors ripping up hallways and shutting off utilities without proper notice, power outages that lasted until dawn, gas lines under repair for days, a broken lock on the main entrance never fixed, little emergencies, one after another, each one just inconvenient enough to push people out. One by one, the neighbors left. Margaret stayed, because she had nowhere else to go. When a burst pipe flooded her bedroom and no one from management responded, when her furniture was ruined and her photographs floated in dirty water, when the smell of damp wood turned the apartment into something unlivable, that was when she filed the claim.
And that was how the Langford name ended up echoing against the walls of Judge Wapner's courtroom. Victoria listened to this as if he foresaw a script she had already read and dismissed. She tilted her head, watching the judge, not the plaintiff. The way some pessoas watch a movie they certain they already know the ending to. Her body language screamed boredom. The faint, impatient tapping of her nails against the defense table punctuated the testimony, sharp and metallic, a small private drumbeat of contempt. She didn't bother to hide it. This wasn't real to her. These were not victims. These were tenants, assets, numbers. She adjusted her bracelet, stealing occasional glances toward the camera operators in the back. She was aware she was being filmed, and if anything, the attention made her posture even more defiant. Her attorney sat beside her, shifting uncomfortably. He had the look of a man who knew exactly how delicate this moment was and exactly how dangerous his client could be. Every time he leaned toward her, whispering something urgent, she barely nodded. She rarely responded. When she did, it was with a small, dismissive flick of her wrist. To her, he was not a counselor. He was an employee. In the front row, a young couple looked at Victoria with disbelief. A man in a maintenance uniform, hands still stained with grease, frowned, his jaw tightening with each no detail Margaret shared. This wasn't just another landlord dispute to them. This was a pattern they recognized and had lived. Judge Wapner listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush. He let the story be told from beginning to end. He watched Margaret's eyes, the way they glistened but held steady, the way her fingers clutched the edge of the stand, not as a performance, but as something to hold on to. He watched Victoria, too, the glances at the clock, the sighs, the whispered comments to her lawyer durante os mais porradas de testemunho. The contrast between them sharpened with every word. On one side of the room, quiet desesperação. Na outra, loud indiferença. The tension thickened, and then, slowly, almost gently, that tension began to turn. When it was time to examine the evidence, the screen flickered to life.
fotos apareceram uma após a outra. Walls stony dark com sprayed mold, os warped floorboards, the sagging ceiling, a child's mattress pulled away from a wet corner. The room shifted. People leaned forward. The images tinham cheiro, even sem som. Old water, rotting plaster, stale ar. The kind of ambiente you don't just see, you felt em seus pulmões. The camera caught Margaret's eyes dropping each time a seu álmarido aparecia na tela. Embaraço mingou com something else, quiet humilhação que essa parte da vida dela fosse agora exposta a estranhos. Across the aisle, Victoria smirked. Era só. Suave taregamento dos lábios, brilho em seus olhos. Para ela, os fotos não eram evidências.
They were criticisms of how she ran her properties. An attack, a public shaming. She didn't respond with empathy, she respondeu with contempt. She leaned back, lips barely moving as she whispered into her attorney's ear. He didn't respond. He knew the cameras were hungry for expressions, for reactions, but she didn't care. Her tone was audible enough for the microphone closest to her to catch a few stray phrases. Of course they took the worst angles. Everyone wants to play victim. Do they understand how a business works? Those words weren't part of the testimony, but they reached the judge, and the audience, and the recording. Judge Wapner's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He didn't look at her right away. He kept his eyes on the photographs. The pipe bursting, the email Margaret sent at 3:11 a.m., her message almost pleading, water everywhere, please someone respond. No reply. Another image, the same pipe, now patched with a strip of peeling duct tape, the surrounding area darkened with rot. The court clerk moved to introduce printed email threads, letters, response times, notices, paper against paper, fact against denial. Layer by layer, a picture formed, not of an unfortunate incident, but of systematic neglect, of pressure, of force disguised as policy. When it was the defense's turn, the room seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment where money usually did its quiet work, where language turned sharp, polished, and cold, where accountability slipped through the gaps between oversight, miscommunication, and standard procedure. Victoria straightened for the first time. Her posture shifted from bored to engaged. Her eyes sharpened, her chin lifted. Now it was her turn, or at least that's what she thought. Her attorney rose, cleared his throat, and began the usual dance. Carefully chosen words about renovations, regulatory compliance, misunderstandings. He tried to distance her. The company owned the building, not her. Management handled day-to-day operations. She was busy. She trusted her staff. For a few moments, it sounded like any other defense in any other property case. But then something subtle changed. Judge Wapner leaned forward. Not enough to break decorum, just enough to signal that the time for vague answers was over. "Counsel," he said evenly, "we'll get to the management. For now, I want to address Miss Langford's involvement specifically." His gaze shifted, directly to Victoria. The air seemed to thicken. "Miss Langford," he continued, "you will answer my questions plainly, under oath." Her eyes narrowed. For the first time, she looked mildly offended. This wasn't a negotiation behind closed doors. There was no assistant to intercept, no family lawyer to whisper, "We'll handle this later." There was only a direct line from her to the bench. Her attorney hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. He knew there was no sidestepping this, not under Wapner. Victoria rose, slowly, deliberately. She moved to the witness stand like it was beneath her, like every step was a reminder that she should not sit the one answering questions. She was the one que asked them. The oath was administered. She recitou ela mecanicamente, as if bored by ritual. "I do." The words felt empty coming from her lips. She sat, crossando as pernas, claspando as mãos as if this fosse uma pressa entrevista que ela não havia agradado. Judge Wapner's voice stayed calm, Measured, controlado. Miss Langford, ele began, do you own, either directly or indirectly, the company that holds the title to the property in question? Her gaze drifted, just for a second, to the camera in the corner, then back to the judge. Yes, she said, indirectly. Indirectly how? The company is part of a larger investment group, she replied, herçada. I'm a stakeholder. There's a board. I don't handle. That's not my question. The interruption was subtle, but it hit with force. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the slightest crack in her polished armor. Are you, or are you not, the majority beneficiary of the profits from that investment group? Wapner asked. She exhaled, annoyed. I receive distributions, yes. In other words, he clarified, when that property generates income, you benefit. Yes, she said, sharper now, as I should. It's my investment. A murmur rippled through the gallery. He let the words sting in the air a moment. As you should, he repeated softly. Noted. Now, he continued, were you aware the conditions of the building prior to Miss Torres filing her claim? Her expression hardened. I receive reports, she replied. Summaries. I don't handle every complaint. That's what management is for. We're not running a charity. These properties are. Miss Langford. The tone shifted. It didn't rise in volume. It simply dropped its patience. This is not a discussion about your business philosophy, Wapner said. It's a question of knowledge and responsibility. She stared at him. Her eyes flashed for the briefest second, a challenge. No one spoke to her like that in her world, not for years. She inhaled slowly. Yes, she finally said, I was aware we were transitioning tenants out of the building for renovations. Some people resist change. They complain. It's expected. The words hung there. People, resist, change. Judge Wapner didn't look away. He didn't flinch. Were you aware, he asked, that your so-called transitioning involved shutting off essential utilities without proper notice, failing to repair water damage, and allowing a known hazard to remain in an occupied unit? Her jaw tightened. I can't verify every situation personally, she snapped. If someone had a problem, they should have moved. It's not my job to... The room went still. Even her attorney looked up sharply. The mask had slipped. No PR filter. No prepared statement. Just truth. Raw, unvarnished, and ugly. It's not your job to... What, Miss Langford?
Wapner asked, voice dangerously quiet. She realized, too tarde, what had been exposed. Her eyes flickered, searching for a way out, for a word to soften what had just come out de sua mouth. To manage individual feelings, she did, modificando. We run businesses. People can't expect. People, he repeated. The word no longer sounded neutral. It sounded heavy, weighted with consequence. In the back row, a woman shook her head slowly. The maintenance worker folded his arms, staring at Victoria with a mixture of anger and grim recognition. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about every time someone with power decided that other human beings were problems, complaints, numbers. And for the first time, Victoria seemed to sense that the room was not with her. She shifted in the chair. Her earlier ease was gone. Now there was a new energy under her skin, not fear exactly, but discomfort. The feeling of someone reaccustomed to control, who suddenly realized control had moved somewhere else, to the bench, to the man watching her with unwavering, steady eyes. Judge Wapner lifted a documento from the file in front of him. It was a printed email, clean, detached, deadly. Miss Langford, he said, is this your correspondence? Her gaze dropped to the page. She recognized it instantly. The subject line, Torres, Unit 3B. The reply, her reply. Yes, she had written it, late at night. irritated by a forwarded chain from management complaining about the uncooperative tenant who was spreading discontent and refusing buyout offers. She hadn't been careful with her words. She hadn't expected them to be read aloud in a court of law. Now they would be, line by line, with the entire room listening. He read, not fast, not slow, just clearly. "If she wants to stay in that dump so badly," he began, and I quote, "stop wasting resources on her. Turn off anything non-essential, pause repairs, and let the building speak for itself. People usually leave when the walls start closing in." End quote. The air was ripped from the room. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Someone in the gallery let out a low, disbelieving sound, half gasp, half bitter laugh. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes, which had held so steady until then, filled instantly. Not because of what had been done, she already knew that part, but because of seeing, in black and white, the intention behind it. This wasn't negligence, this was strategy. Victoria's face changed. For the first time, the composure cracked. A faint flush rose in her cheeks. Her eyes hardened, not with shame, but with the furious realization that she had been exposed, that something she believed would stay in the shadows had been dragged into the light. She shifted forward. "That's being taken out of context," Wapner interrupted, eyes unwavering. "Feel free to provide the context in which such a directive would be appropriate." She opened her mouth.
Then closed it. There was no context, only cruelty. Calculated, profitable, documented. He continued, lifting another page. "Here," he said, "is a follow-up email from your management team, dated 48 hours later. It states, and again I quote, 'Per your instruction, we've deprioritized non-life-threatening repairs in Torres' unit. Plumbing issue noted, will revisit once she vacates or accepts compensation. In the meantime, we've suspended discretionary maintenance on her floor.'" He let the words settle. Non-life-threatening. Discretionary. Language designed to sound clinical. But what it meant was simple. Suffer until you break. Victoria's lips parted, her voice finally rising, tinted with outrage. "That's standard practice in—" "In where?" he asked sharply. "In whose world is it standard practice to deliberately worsen living conditions to force a tenant out?" Her eyes flashed. "In real estate," she said bitterly. "In the real world. You can't run these buildings on emotion. People can move. They're not prisoners. If they don't like it, they find another place. That's how the market works." A hush smothered the room. She had said the quiet part aloud, the part most people suspected existed behind luxury gates and corporate titles. Judge Wapner took off his glasses. He cleaned them slowly, not because they needed it, but because the courtroom needed the pause. It needed to feel the full weight of what had just been admitted, not in legal jargon, but in plain, brutal honesty. "Ms. Langford," he said, his voice dropping lower, almost solemn, "this is not a market. This is a court." He slid the glasses back on. "And people's lives," he continued, "are not variables in your profit margin." She stared at him. For the first time, there was something like uncertainty in her gaze. Not humility, not yet, but the first flicker of understanding that the old tools, money, status, intimidation, might not work here. That in this room, the currency was something else. Truth, accountability, consequences. The tension, once invisible, now had a shape. It was the narrowing of shoulders in the gallery, the way people sat forward, elbows on knees,
Eyes locked on the exchange. It was the faint shaking of Margaret's hands. It was the silence of Victoria's attorney, who now seemed to be folding inward, shrinking from the blast radius of his client's arrogance. The camera zoomed. They caught everything. The edge in Victoria's expression, the small twitch in her jaw, the faint, controlled fury of someone who had been publicly cornered. She was used to winning, but this didn't feel like a negotiation anymore. It felt like a verdict in slow motion. Wapner lifted another document. "Miss Langford," he said calmly, "did you or did you not authorize the halt of repairs in Miss Torres's unit, despite being informed of significant water damage?" "I authorized prioritization," she snapped. "We have dozens of units. I said to focus on vacant ones first."
"We can't just pour money into—" He raised a hand, a simple gesture, silencing. "This is not un debate," he reminded her. "It's a question. You were told that her unit had significant water damage, correct?" "Yes," she bit out. "And after being told that," he continued, steady as a blade, "you gave the instruction that her repairs were to be deprioritized until she vacated." Silence. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering urgently, "Answer the question, directly." She swallowed. Her voice, when it came, had lost its earlier smoothness. "Yes," she said. There it was, one word, heavy enough to shift everything. The gallery reacted, this time not with shock, with something harsher, cold anger. People exchanged looks. A man in the back shook his head slowly, lips pressed tight. A young woman muttered under her breath, barely audible. Of course she did. On the stand, Margaret wiped at her eyes quickly, trying not to draw attention. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The damage had already spoken for her, visibly, on screen, in words, on paper, and now out of Victoria's own mouth, under oath. Judge Wapner straightened in his chair. The shift was subtle, but the atmosphere followed it. This was the moment where tension turned to judgment. Not legal judgment, not yet. Moral judgment. The kind that outlives paperwork. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, voice firm. "You deliberately withheld necessary repairs to an occupied unit in order to pressure a tenant into leaving. That is what you did." Her eyes flashed. "That's your interpretation," she protested. "No," he replied sharply. "That is your action. My role is to determine its consequences." He turned slightly, addressing the courtroom at large now, but never taking his eyes fully off her. "This is not a case about confusion," he said. "This is not a case about a lost work order or a misfiled request. This is a case about deliberate indifference, about weaponizing living conditions to enforce financial goals." He paused. The silence trembled. "In this courtroom," he continued, "those goals do not justify that conduct." Victoria's lips curled, sarcastic, defiant. "If every landlord was hauled in for this," she said bitterly, "half this city would be in here." A few people exhaled sharply. There it was again. The assumption not just that this behavior was normal, but that normality made it acceptable. The cynical logic of someone who had never truly been held accountable. Judge Wapner's response was quiet. "You may be right," he said. "Perhaps there are many we do not see here, but today you are here." Her eyes widened just slightly. It was a simple sentence, but it carried a brutal finality. Today, you are here, and there would be no stepping around it. The closing arguments weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. The drama had already unfolded. What remained now was something colder, inevitable, predictable. The defense tried one last time to soften the impact.
to frame the emails as poorly worded, to suggest that the water damage, though regrettable, had not rendered the unit technically uninhabitable, to argue that compensation had been offered. The words dropped like dull stones. They didn't sink. They didn't change the current. They just made small, meaningless ripples. The plaintiff's side didn't grandstand. They didn't need to. The evidence had already spoken more loudly than any speech could. What the court had seen was not a single misstep, but a mindset, a belief that power could bend everything, including the law, to its interests. Judge Wapner called for a short recess. The room exhaled. People stood, stretching stiff limbs. Conversations began in whispers, then rose, then quieted when they noticed the camera still watching. Victoria remained seated, eyes narrowed, fury simmering unseen beneath a calm mask. She leaned toward her attorney, hissing something low and clipped. He answered softly, none of his words reaching the microphones, but his face pale with the realization that some fights cannot be spun. A door opened. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. They rose, every one of them. This time, Victoria stood without hesitation, not because she respected the court, but because, for the first time, she sensed the cost of not respecting it. Judge Wapner returned. He didn't draw it out. He didn't need to. The weight of the decision had already filled the room before he spoke. I've considered the testimony, he began, the evidence presented, and the admissions made under oath. His tone was controlled, but there was a hard edge in it now, a finality. In this case, he continued, we are not dealing with a simple breach of contract or a routine landlord-tenant disagreement. We are dealing with conduct that is calculated, targeted, and cruel. He turned to Margaret. Her shoulders were drawn inward, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. Her eyes were downcast, bracing. Miss Torres, he said, voice softening only a fraction. You were entitled to a safe, habitable home as long as you fulfilled your duties as a tenant. You did. They did not. Her breath hitched. He turned back. The softness vanished. Miss Langford, he said, you treated this woman's home as leverage. You weaponized basic human needs, heat, water, structural safety, to achieve compliance. He leaned forward. I find that conduct morally reprehensible and legally indefensible. The words hit with the force of a gavel even before he raised one. The camera zoomed in on Victoria. Her face went still, expressionless, but in her eyes, a flicker, not of remorse, of something more primitive, fear. The first taste of a consequence she couldn't buy her way out of, couldn't defer, couldn't hand off to an assistant. Judgment is entered in favor of the plaintiff, Wapner declared. The gallery stilled, but he wasn't finished. Miss Torres is awarded full compensation for the damage to her property, the costs incurred, and additional damages for the distress and disruption caused by your intentional actions. He paused, then added, substantial damages. Her lawyer's shoulders slumped. Victoria inhaled sharply, jaw clenching so hard a muscle in her cheek jumped. Money. That was the language she understood, and she was about to lose a lot of it. But that was not the end, not the real blow. Awarding financial damages is the bare minimum, Wapner continued. It restores, to the extent possible, what was taken. His gaze didn't waver. But there is something else at stake here, and that is the principle that in this courtroom, your status, your wealth, your last name mean nothing when weighed against your responsibility to other human beings. His words cut clean. Nothing. Victoria's throat worked. She said nothing, for once. Your attitude throughout these proceedings, he went on, has been dismissive, entitled, and utterly devoid of empathy. You spoke of people as obstacles, of homes as disposable assets, of suffering as acceptable collateral for your profit. He shook his head slowly. "That may be the real world you spoke of," he said. "It is not the world I recognize in this court." The gallery watched, rapt. Every sentence landed like exposed truth. Not just about her, about the divide between those who can afford to see others as numbers and those who cannot afford to be seen that way. "I cannot change your character," he said. "That is not within my power. But I can, and I will, ensure that your actions in this matter are recorded in a way you cannot erase, cannot hide behind holding companies, and cannot bury under paperwork." He turned slightly to the clerk. "This judgment," he stated firmly, "will note specifically that the landlord's conduct was deliberate, coercive, and in willful disregard of the tenant's basic rights and well-being." He looked back at her. "And it will bear your name." Her eyes flashed. There it was, the real punishment. Not just money, legacy. Her name, which had always been her shield, her key, her weapon, now bound to a record of cruelty, preserved in transcripts, indexed, searchable, a stain that wouldn't wash off. The camera caught the precise moment the realization sank in. The slight whitening of her eyes, the shallow, quickened breath, the tightening grip of her perfectly manicured hand on the edge of the table. Judge Wapner's voice remained even. "In my courtroom," he said, final now, "you are not an heiress. You are not a brand. You are a party to a case held to the same standard as anyone else." His gaze didn't soften. "And when you abuse those beneath you," he concluded, "you answer for it." He lifted the gavel. The room braced. "For the record," he added, eyes locked on hers, "consider this a very clear message. Your money cannot buy you immunity from decency." The gavel came down, one sharp, echoing strike. Case closed. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the sound of the gavel had frozen a room. Then, slowly, energy had returned. Someone in the back let out a breath they'd clearly been holding for too long. A quiet murmur rose, not loud, not chaotic, just a low, shared sense of something rare. Justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real, concrete, visible. Margaret remained seated, stunned. The words were still settling around her. She wasn't used to winning. She wasn't used to being believed. For so long, her complaints had gone unanswered, her calls unreturned. Now she had been heard, publicly, recorded, vindicated. A court officer approached, speaking to her in a gentle tone, explaining what would happen next, the steps, the formalities. But her eyes, for a moment, drifted to the bench, to the man who had looked at her not as a problem, not as a number, but as a person. Tears slipped free. This time, she didn't wipe them away. Across the aisle, Victoria rose slowly. The defiance hadn't disappeared. It had just dimmed. Her movements were stiffer now, metal under silk. She picked up her designer bag with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She turned, for the briefest instant, toward Margaret. Their eyes met. It was not an apology. But it was the first time in the entire hearing that Victoria had actually looked at her, really looked. Not as an entry on a spreadsheet, not as a complaint in an inbox, but as a face, a person. Someone whose life had been twisted by a decision she made in seconds with a careless email. And then the moment passed. She looked away first. Of course she did. She moved toward the exit, each step clipped, heels striking the floor with forced composure. The cameras followed. They captured every frame of the fall, not of a bank balance, not of a brand, but of an illusion. The illusion that people like her were untouchable. In that small rectangle of a courtroom, the myth had been torn apart. Not with shouting, not with spectacle, with something much more devastating. Calm, unyielding authority, and the truth. As the credits of the court recording metaphorically rolled, the clip didn't just end, it exploded, again and again, shared, reposted, recut. The moment Judge Wapner read her email, The instant he said, "That is morally reprehensible," the sentence that hit millions of screens. In this courtroom, your status, your wealth, your last name mean nothing. Viewers paused, rewound, watched again. The story resonated far beyond the details of a single flooded apartment and a cruel eviction strategy. It struck a nerve sharpened by 1,000 smaller injustices, by millions of people who had felt small in front of someone who believed they were above consequence. Comments poured in. Watching her face when the email was read was satisfying. "I've lived this. Different landlord, same attitude. Thank you, Judge." This is why cameras in the courtroom matter. People need to see this.
Victoria Langford had gone into that courtroom convinced it was an inconvenience. She walked out a symbol, not of power, but of something else, of entitlement confronted, of cruelty exposed, of privilege stripped bare. Not by a mob, not by scandal, by a simple, unshakable idea. In front of the law, you are just a person. And when you try to crush someone who has nothing under the eye of someone like Joseph Wapner, you don't always walk away unscathed. Sometimes you walk away marked. Sometimes you walk away diminished. Sometimes, for the first time in your life, you walk away regretting. Not because you finally understand the people you hurt, but because, finally, you couldn't escape the cost of hurting them. In the end, the image that lived on wasn't just the heiress with the designer suit and the venomous email. It was the quiet woman on the witness stand, hands shaking, eyes wet, standing a little straighter as the judge's words settled around her. It was the look in her eyes as she realized, for once, she had won. And somewhere, silently, in millions of living rooms, millions of screens, people watched that moment and felt something deep and rare and necessary. Not envy, not outrage, but a hard, quiet satisfaction. The feeling que, even if only for a bright moment, the scales had balanced. And someone who had spent lifetime looking down on others had finally been forced to look up, at the bench, at the law, at the consequences, and at the one man in that room she could not outspend, outtalk, or outmaneuver, Judge Joseph Wapner.